All right, so welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. It's our final session for the term. My name is Kevala. I also go by Kiva. And today we'll be subverting tropes. So, what is a trope? And how is it different from a cliche? Well, a trope is something you have most definitely come across in any form of media, whether it be a book, film, short story, and even poetry. A trope in a story context is any plot, character, setting, device, or pattern that we recognize as such. It's a repeated common element. It's kind of everything from the unassuming farm boy to the rebellion against an oppressive government to the wise mentor to the epic car chase scene. Cliches are phrases or opinions that are overused and they lack original thought. Tropes have a sense of familiarity and excitement, that secondhand adrenaline you feel when the hero's gearing up to take on some bad guys, or that anxious, palms are sweaty, knees weak, arms are heavy feeling when professing your love to your crush. More so, tropes give your story texture. While common, tropes are what makes stories run. And this is very important. A story is not good or bad based on whether or not it has tropes. All stories have tropes. A story, however, is good or bad based on how those tropes are used. So, tropes can get predictable to the point of boredom, and that's when it becomes a cliche because it becomes something that's overused. So, how do we avoid boring plot lines and tropes? We subvert them and we create interesting plot twists. So, subverting essentially makes you think that a trope is going to happen, but it doesn't. So, tropes already live in the minds of the audience. As such, they can predict a familiar trope coming based on the hints dropped by the writer. So, when the writer decides to build on this expectation, only to reveal that the expected trope was a false clue, which is something called a red herring, but I'll get to that in a moment, an entirely different situation results, and thus you have a subverted trope. So the work is ultimately revealed not to be using the trope at all, but it was played up to look like it was. So a subversion has two mandatory segments. The expectation is set up that something we have seen plenty of times before is coming, then that setup is paid off with something else entirely. So the setup is the trope, and the something else is the subversion. Before I move on, are there any questions? Okay, cool. So hopefully you may have seen random fish throughout the previous slides. This fish is a red herring, and this was my attempt at distracting you. A red herring is a really good plot device to use, especially if you're looking to invoke a plot twist. So, what is a red herring? It's a clue that leads in the wrong direction. It's something that is used to divert attention from the truth. So, a red herring is supposed to distract and mislead audiences so that there's a surprising twist that audiences didn't see coming. It's the writer's equivalent of a magician's trick. It's the waving of one hand to distract whilst the other hand does the real work. It's not the only way of subverting tropes, but it is one of the most commonly used ones because of how well it works when used properly. So, red herrings are often coupled with the storyline where the obvious suspect is used as a red herring and the real culprit turns out to be someone unexpected. So, think along the lines of Scooby Doo. Often, the shady character is made out to look like the bad guy, and when they do the huge reveal at the end, when the mask eventually comes off, the bad guy has been somebody else all along. So, the shady character was a red herring, a device used to distract you from what's really going on. So, before I get into some good examples of a red herring or red herrings, do any of you have examples of red herrings you'd like to mention or discuss?
Hi, I'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, there's a movie called Zootopia. It's an animation by Disney. It came out a few years ago. And throughout the movie, there's an organization that's essentially turning animals rogue, right? and I guess people in this society are very passive, and they don't attack one another. Anyway, the movie sort of set up to make you think that the mayor's behind it, right? So the sort of corrupt politician kind of idea, and then towards the end of the movie, we find out that it wasn't actually the lion, but rather the assistant who was actually a sheep. And I just thought that was a really interesting way of subverting, like the normal trope, especially because the lion is the predator. It's this big menacing animal, and then the sheep is the innocent, you know, um, I guess animal, and it kind of messes around with that idea of, okay, it's always a sheep in was it a wolf in sheep's clothing? So I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do notice that there are a lot of animated movies recently that have been taking really good like or common tropes and they've been subverting that. So thank you for that example. It's a really good way of just of displaying a subverted trope. Are there any other red herrings in particular that anyone would like to like discuss? Okay, so I have some examples. So the first one is oh, a quick warning, I should say. We are heading into a bit of a spoiler zone area, especially with the examples that I've put throughout this presentation. So just be wary of that. So, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that is a Quentin Tarantino movie. So, Sharon Tate, the famous 60s Hollywood actress, and the infamous Manson murders serve as a major backdrop for the film. And as the plot progresses, the audience's expectations regarding the movies are, I mean, excuse me, regarding the murders are built up, and this is what is expected. So the plot is subverted, and we instead get an alternate universe where the murders don't take place. So red herrings, especially in this plot line, aid in building suspense because as the viewer watches this movie, we already have knowledge of the Manson murders and what happened to Sharon Tate in the back of our heads or in our minds. And so we're expecting this to be shown or displayed or carried out in the movie itself, but that never happens. And so that's a really nice red herring or a sort of plot device used to distract your audience. The second one, moving on to a novel, The Da Vinci Code. So Dan Brown cleverly disguises his red herring in plain sight through the use of the character Bishop Aringarosa. So in Italian, Aringa means herring and Rosa means red. So he quite literally is a red herring. So Brown sets up the story so that it looks like Aringarosa is the mastermind behind all the evil goings on. Of course, it turns out someone else was pulling the strings all along. So these are just small examples of how red herrings, as a plot device that's used for distracting your audience, can be used. So, how do we subvert a trope? Well, it helps to be aware of common elements and tropes. So try to consume as much media and material as you possibly can. To consciously use tropes, you need to have some sort of knowledge of them. You need to specifically know what they are and how they're used. Once you are aware of a particular trope, you can choose to subvert it. But to do this properly, you need to focus on two aspects: the internal plotline consistency as well as logic. Subverting a trope isn't simply as easy as yanking the rug out from under the audience and saying, "Surprise, I didn't do this." There are books that do this, and they're known, unfortunately, for being jarring in their joy at subverting things because all they do is shout, "Haha, fooled you," at the reader while doing an abrupt right angle. So they subvert the trope for the sake of subverting the trope and to sound, in air quotes, clever, rather than to tell a good story that plays consistently internally. So, if you're going to subvert a trope, it needs to be a logical subversion that flows within the story's internal plotline consistency. The characters can't just defy a trope for no other reason than, "Look, I'm defying this trope." They need to have reasons why they would go against the grain or shift gears. And you need to make that logic clear so that when the subversion does happen, your reader thinks to themselves, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." So, You need to know the tropes and what the framework of your plot is. And then, if you want to subvert them, you need to set up the story in advance so that the audience can understand how and why you broke the framework. And that's pretty much it. Know the tropes, know how or where they're applied, so that if you do want to subvert them, you know what steps you need to take in advance to do so. In addition, if you don't subvert anything, that's perfectly fine. Playing tropes as they are can still give rise to a solid, fresh story or narrative. After all, tropes are not cliches, but they can become one. So before we look at some good examples of what good tropes are there any questions? Okay. So, going along with the theme of animated movies, thanks, Mark, for the Zootopia example. Another animated movie I know is, again, targeted mainly for kids, but I feel adults can enjoy it as well, is Megamind. So I thought Megamind was fantastic because even though it used all the superhero tropes, it never played them straight. It took one of the oldest tropes, the villain captures the goal, threatens the hero, and the hero outsmarts the villain. And it showed that the characters themselves were trope savvy or consciously aware that they were being cliches, like the girl mocks the villain's threats as a cliche. And then things are twisted. The villain kills the hero, and that's just when the movie starts. So, if you can, check this movie out for a very refreshing take on tropes. For a novel, Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. So, tragic romance is such a common trope, and it's the center of many young adult novels. What Jesse Andrews does in this novel is to give the reader every reason to assume a tragic romance is coming and then substitute a tragic friendship instead, which is no less devastating and no less compelling. Andrews captures the thrilling confusion of the teen years and develops deep characters whose emotions float to the surface of every page. It's a beautiful and tragic story that isn't your typical John Green, The Fault in Our Stars trope. And then a very nice poem as an example of a trope that's been subverted is Blue Rain by Sasi Priyadarshini. So it is a bit long, but it is very, very beautiful. So I'll just read it out quickly. She showed up at dawn, early and in vain. Oh no, not her, not today, not again. Gone are the days she gave me hope. She was my sickness, my remedy, my dope. When I watched her, my eyes would forget to flick, tracing the way she moved so slender and slick. With a sneaky smile, she got a hold of my palm, and the chaos of the world melted in her charm. Her slightest touch sent chills down my spine. Buried in her bosom, I was hers and she was mine. Just when the moment came for us to rejoice, she had already made the tougher choice. I'll be back, she casually said before she left. Life went on, only more barren and bereft. I waited for days, then weeks for her to drop a hint, begging the skies to resume their grayish tint. And come she did, I didn't know who to blame. Something was amiss, she was not the same. She called out for me in a pleading tone, but I wanted to be alone, my heart now a stone. She mourned her plight, drenching in sorrow. All night she cried, till it be morrow. She knelt and rolled in stories she told. I moved not an inch, my toes were getting cold. Yet she showed up at dawn, early and in vain. Oh no, not again. I sighed at her. The rain. So this poem subverts the usual love poem or your love sonnet or ballad, where at first glance you think the subject is the poet's lover or partner, but alas, they are talking about rain instead. So that's a pretty lovely subversion there. An honorable and dishonorable mention of an example is Game of Thrones. So Ned Stark's demise was a beautiful plot twist and subverted trope where the supposed hero of the story finds out all these juicy secrets and that threaten the throne, and he attempts to correct the wrongdoings and achieve justice. But when he was to be executed, naturally the audience thought there's no way they're going to kill off the main character. But he was killed off anyway, and much to everyone's shock, and this was good because it remained consistent with the plotline. However, the ending of Game of Thrones, the TV show, is a prime example of when tropes are subverted carelessly. So the writers instead subverted 5 years of character building, all for shock value, thus resulting in illogical plot lines. And this is something we, as writers, want to avoid. So you can never go wrong with a solid, logical plotline. Some things to consider when you're handling tropes. Tropes are not bad, nor are cliches. In truth, cliches are quite subjective. Just because a trope can be a cliche does not mean that it is one. I can't make that any clearer, but a trope is not a cliche. Tropes are unavoidable. Whether you know them or not, you will end up using some sort of common element. If you subvert the trope, you're essentially creating an outlier, an abnormality, something the reader does not expect and does not regard as normal per se. It generally needs to be justified and then also needs to influence the story. And the more unusual the abnormality, the more influence it should have in the story. So the greater the subversion, the more influence it needs to have in your story. So, are there any final thoughts and questions before we get to the prompt? So, here is a table of some tropes and situations, or rather stereotyped characters that you can subvert. So pick a stereotype character and a situation, mix and match and subvert them by either brainstorming or creating a story. Or you can pick your own trope, something that's not on the table, and subvert it in the most creative way you can. Um, I think it's a fun exercise to do in about 10 minutes. After that, we can share our ideas and subversions, and then we can conclude the session thereafter. So if you have any questions, please raise them now. If not, 10 minutes starts now, so you can start writing. Okay. So if anyone feels like sharing what they've written, go ahead.
Cool. Shall I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. The sky was thick with ash, and the air was heavy, clogging the lungs of whoever dared take an extended breath. Percy's legs felt heavy as a sense of an ending numbed what feeling was left. He needed to stop. After stumbling for a few minutes, he found a tree stump that had not yet turned to cinder. The sensation of sitting gave him a brief sense of relief, a few seconds to forget the seemingly doomed situation. He had to keep moving. Careful not to take breaths through his mouth, he mustered what energy he had left and rose for what might be the last time. Minutes turned to decades as his legs trudged through the scorched earth. Then, after hours he had no intention on counting, he stumbled across a decrepit stone building. What were once vines that scaled its wall were now shriveled at its base. He ventured inside and took a look around, hoping for food or water that had miraculously survived whatever had cursed humanity. However, in doing so, Percy's foot snagged what was left of a vine, sending him sprawling across the floor and the doorway behind him crumbling, sealing him in a stone coffin. The 16th century had not started well. So I chose the night quote and paired it with the post-apocalyptic world, and I thought it might be interesting to see what a post-apocalyptic world might look like in a 16th century compared to what is so commonly a futuristic take on it. So yeah, that was my subversion.
That was great. Well done. Loved it. I think it's such an interesting subversion as well. So you did that. You did that justice. Nice.
Thank you.
Jules, do you want to read it out or nominate one of Com to read it out? Okay. Monk who commits adultery. Okay. I pray to God every day to forgive me of my sins. I hold a rosary to my lips, but all I can think of are her lips, touching mine, so soft and so sinful. I say the Our Father more vehemently now, but still the image of her eyes persists in my mind. She's looking at me, really looking at me. Her gaze is dripping down my bare chest. She's dressed in my robes. No, I must forget. But her voice rings in my ears, whispering sweet nothings, and I can't imagine why the Bible has deemed this a sin, this act of pure pleasure. How could it be wrong? She's moaning my name now, her fingers clawing into my neck, and I fall to my knees from the pew. This memory of ecstasy haunts me. Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. I croak to the empty chapel, but the only reply I get is from her sultry voice ringing in my head. Let's do it again. Very saucy. Love it. That was really, really nice. So, does anyone else have anything to say or share? Yeah, I agree. The ending is just chef's kiss. Perfect. I think we can conclude this session. I just wanted to say thank you for joining us this evening, and as well as our previous sessions this term. And thank you so much for engaging and sharing your work. I think we are possibly looking at sending out writing prompts every Tuesday until I think the term officially ends, and in place of these sessions. So you'll get like a chance to sort of continue writing creatively. Please do send through any of your pieces, even ones written from any of the prompts given this term. We're happy to provide feedback or help provide guidance if you feel you need it. Also, look out for the email on our anthology. That'll be out in the coming weeks or so. We'd love to feature and publish your work, so please do consider contributing. And finally, I think good luck with the exams. Study well and be sure to take care of yourself. If you do need access to any mental health resources, please feel free to reach out to us and we can assist you where possible. I think that's it from me. So stay safe and warm, and I hope you have a lovely evening. I wanted to make this session as short as possible because I do realize, with it is kind of Hell Week, and it is we're all busy with academics and all of that. So yeah, thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Dylan and Jules, for sharing. And yeah, good night and goodbye.
Thank you. Love the session. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you. Bye.